The rain was a constant, a sound so deeply woven into the fabric of my existence here that silence would feel like a rupture. It slicked the broad, dark green needles of the Douglas firs and Sitka spruces that crowded my house, a relentless vertical siege of timber that had stood for longer than the United States had been a country. They formed a wall, not of protection, but of isolation. My house was a stark modernist box of glass and steel dropped into this primeval dampness, an architectural statement that had long ago lost its meaning. Inside, everything was sterile, precise. Polished concrete floors, furniture that was more sculpture than comfort, a kitchen where nothing had been cooked in weeks. It was a showroom for a life I wasn't living. This calculated order was a lie. Below my feet, in the climate-controlled basement, was the truth of my 3 centuries. A chaotic jumble of artifacts I couldn't bring myself to discard. A Revolutionary War musket leaned against a 1980s arcade cabinet. A stack of first edition novels from the 1800s served as a stand for a humming server rack. Each object was a ghost, a remnant of a Julian Croft who had been fascinated by something, anything for a time. Now, they were just clutter, the weight of accumulated history. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the gray belly of the sky sag lower over the Oregon coast. I looked 35, maybe. A good jawline, eyes that had been called soulful by people long since turned to dust. A body kept in shape by the sheer unending boredom of maintenance. But inside, I was ancient, eroded, a landmark that tourists no longer visited. My immortality wasn't a gift or a curse anymore. It was an absurdity, a cosmic clerical error that no one had the authority to correct. The last time I'd tried to force a correction was 6 months ago. The sheer idiocy of it still made my teeth ache. I'd driven my vintage Land Rover, another relic of a forgotten phase, all the way to Yellowstone. I had this grand, dramatic vision, death by nature, a primal end. I found the biggest bull bison I could, a 2,000-pound mountain of muscle and matted fur. It was magnificent, a creature of pure, stupid power. I got out of the car, walked to within 50 feet, and started yelling at it. I waved my arms, I threw rocks at its flank. I called its mother some very unkind things. The bison stopped chewing. It turned its massive head, and its dark, glassy eyes fixed on me. There was no rage in them, no animal fury. There was only a profound geological scale weariness, as if it were looking at the dumbest thing it had seen in its long, grass-filled life. It blinked slowly, let out a huff of grassy breath that misted in the cold Wyoming air, and then, with a dignity I could never hope to possess, it simply turned and walked away. It didn't even grant me the respect of a charge. I was a nuisance, a fly. I stood there in the vast, silent park, feeling the full, crushing weight of my own ridiculousness. I hadn't felt anger or despair. I had felt embarrassed. You can't even get a bison to kill you. How pathetic is that? That was the real horror of it. Not the loneliness, not the grief that had long ago calcified into a dull ache. It was the farce. My existence was a long-running, poorly written joke, and I was the only one left in the audience. I turned from the window and descended the floating steel staircase into the basement. The air was cool and dry, the hum of the dehumidifiers a constant whisper. I needed a project, a distraction. I knelt before a heavy sea chest bound in iron straps, a purchase from a long-defunct Boston shipyard in what? 1840, 1850. The lock was rusted shut, but a few minutes with a grinder from my metalworking phase took care of that. Inside, nestled in yellowed linen, was a collection of daguerreotypes, small silvered plates holding captured ghosts. I picked one up, a woman. Her hair was pulled back severely, her eyes dark and serious, her mouth a firm, unsmiling line. There was a brooch at her throat, intricately carved. I knew her. I had loved her. I had held her hand as she died of consumption, her breath rattling in her chest like dry leaves. I had sat by her grave for a week, waiting for a grief that was already becoming a memory, and I could not, for the life of me, remember her name. It wasn't a sudden lapse. It was a confirmation of a slow, horrifying erosion. I had her face, a moment of her life trapped in silver and mercury, but the rest was gone. The sound of her laugh, the scent of her skin, the name her parents had given her, all of it had been scoured from my mind by the sheer grinding abrasion of time. Eternity wasn't just erasing the world around me. It was hollowing me out from the inside, leaving a shell that looked like a man, but was filled with nothing but echoes and dust. That was it. The last straw. The final, quiet insult. I left the daguerreotype on the floor and went to the server rack. My fingers flew across the keyboard, muscle memory from decades of diving into the digital world, the only frontier that still felt new. I bypassed firewalls, hopped through proxies, and descended into the dark, encrypted corners of the web. I'd learned coding in the 70s, hacking in the 80s, and built my fortune on a deep understanding of the networks that now bound the world together. It was another skill, another phase. But this time, it had a purpose. I was looking for a myth, a whisper I'd heard years ago. A place for people like me. Not the glamorous, tortured souls of fiction, but the cosmic driftwood. The glitches. I found it on a forum that required a quantum encryption key to even view. The page was stark black, with a single line of gray text at the top. The egress protocol. It was a support group for the terminally alive. Posts were sporadic, written in codes and allegories. A user named Nosferatu_Blues complained about the inconsistent quality of black market synthetic blood. Echo_the_ machine wrote in fragmented verses about the loneliness of being static. Dust_to_dust posted a long, dry treatise on the tensile strength of ancient linen. They were all like me, cursed with life and bored to the point of madness. I opened a new thread. My message was short, stripped of all hope, and drenched in the sarcasm that was my only remaining shield. Subject: job opening. Seeking competent force of nature to facilitate cessation of existence. 3 centuries of experience in failing to die. Have tried beasts, blades, heights, and poisons. Open to suggestions. Willing to work with gods, demons, or particularly ambitious wildlife. Please, no more bison. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, the hum of the server a hollow sound in the concrete tomb of my past. I didn't expect a reply for days, if ever. The notification pinged in less than a minute. It was a direct message, untraceable, unsigned. The text was brutally efficient. Cape Disappointment. The lighthouse, tomorrow, midnight. Come alone. Cape Disappointment. The name was so perfectly, so beautifully on the nose, I almost laughed. For the first time in a very, very long time, I felt a flicker of something other than weariness. It might have been hope. Or maybe it was just the thrill of knowing that tomorrow, my long, lousy Tuesday, might finally, blessedly come to an end. The drive up the 101 was a pilgrimage through my own personal purgatory. The relentless wipers smeared the Oregon rain across the windshield, blurring the endless walls of dripping green into a watercolor nightmare. I crossed the Astoria Megler Bridge as a low-slung fog bank rolled in from the Pacific, swallowing the colossal structure whole. For a few minutes, I was suspended in a world of gray with no visible past or future, only the hum of tires on wet metal and the groan of the bridge in the wind. It felt appropriate. Cape Disappointment. The place was well named. It wasn't a gentle cape, but a jagged black fang of basalt jutting into the mouth of the Columbia River, a place sailors had called the graveyard of the Pacific for centuries. The lighthouse stood at its very tip, a whitewashed sentinel against a churning, furious sea. I parked the Land Rover in the deserted lot and walked the slick, treacherous path. The wind hit me like a physical blow, tearing at my jacket, its howl a raw, elemental scream. It carried the sting of salt and the cold, clean scent of deep water. The lighthouse beam, a blade of pure white light, sliced through the fog and darkness in a hypnotic, repeating rhythm. Once, twice, then gone. The service door was unlocked, as the message had promised. It groaned open on rusted hinges, revealing a spiral staircase ascending into darkness. The air inside was thick with the smell of brine and old iron. I pulled a high-powered flashlight from my pocket, another tool from another hobby, and its beam cut a solid cone through the gloom. I started to climb. The meeting was in the lantern room at the very top. The space was cramped, a circle of glass panes looking out on the raging storm. The massive Fresnel lens, a beautiful, intricate beehive of glass, sat cold and dark. The light I'd seen from outside was an automated beacon on the exterior. The only illumination came from a pair of battery-powered lanterns set on the floor, casting a flickering, anemic glow. And in that unsteady light, I saw them, my fellow applicants for oblivion. The first was leaning against the curved wall, a study in elegant decay. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored tweed suit that looked like it had been fashionable in 1925. He was tall and impossibly thin, with slicked-back dark hair and a face so pale it seemed to absorb the lantern light. A lit cigarette, held between long, slender fingers, trailed a ribbon of smoke that eddied in the drafts. He looked like a character F. Scott Fitzgerald had forgotten to write, right down to the silver flask he held loosely in his other hand. As I entered, he gave me a slow, languid nod. His eyes held a deep, profound pain. The second was harder to see. There was a cold spot near the window, a subtle shimmering in the air like heat haze on a summer road. At its center was the faint, translucent outline of a girl with long, wild hair and a fringed suede vest. She looked no older than 20, a ghost. But the strangest part was the source of her voice. The man in the suit had a vintage transistor radio sitting on the floor beside him. It was crackling with static, but through the noise, fragments of sound coalesced. Flowers in your hair. A snatch of an old song, then a whispery, distorted voice, like a message from a distant star. So cold. The third member of our sad little club sat cross-legged on the floor, looking profoundly uncomfortable. He was a man, or what was left of one. His body was desiccated, wrapped in strips of linen that were visible at his neck and wrists. He wore modern, ill-fitting clothes, a Portland Trail Blazers hoodie and a pair of jeans that hung on his skeletal frame like a scarecrow's rags. His skin was the color of ancient parchment, stretched taut over a skull with empty, shadowed sockets. As he shifted, a fine cloud of dust puffed from his body, catching the lantern light like malevolent glitter. He sneezed, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to shake his entire body. Silence hung in the room for a long moment, broken only by the wind, the static from the radio, and the mummy's occasional dusty sneeze. I was the one to break it. "Julian," I said, my voice sounding rough in the enclosed space. "I'm the one who posted about the bison." The man in the suit pushed himself off the wall. He moved with a stiff grace, as if every joint ached. "Leland," he said, his voice a low, cultured baritone that was frayed at the edges with exhaustion. "A pleasure. I'm the one complaining about the plumbing." He took a sip from his flask, winced, and shuddered. "And this," he gestured with the flask towards the radio, "is Beatrice. B for short." The radio crackled. "Love is all you need." Then the whisper, clearer this time. "Hello, Julian." "Beatrice Holloway," Leland clarified. "Class of 67. Her astral form is a bit low bandwidth. She communicates through this. It's the only way we can hear her." I looked at the mummy. He unfolded himself with a series of dry creaks and stood up. He was taller than I'd expected. "I am Pachakuti," he said. His English was precise, with a strange, formal cadence. Though the employees at the Field Museum in Chicago called me Pat. He brushed a fine layer of dust from his sleeve. "I am the one who wrote of the linen." He sneezed again, a violent, full-body convulsion. "I am allergic to myself." The sheer, unvarnished misery in the room was a tangible thing. This wasn't a gathering of powerful, brooding immortals. This was a support group for cosmic punchlines. "So," Leland began, taking another reluctant sip from his flask, "you're like me?" It wasn't a question about immortality, but about the nature of the trap. 327 years, I said. Give or take. A failed alchemical experiment. It was meant to cure a fever. It worked a little too well. Leland let out a dry, mirthless chuckle. "Anarchists in Chicago, 1928. A bootlegger's war. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. A stray bullet and a helpful stranger. Turns out I wasn't just turned into one of the children of the night." He tapped a finger against his temple. "I have a rare form of hemophilia. My body can't process hemoglobin correctly. Every drop of blood I consume, real or synthetic, triggers a migraine that feels like my skull is trying to give birth to an ice pick." He held up the flask. "This is a synthetic nutrient solution. Tastes like warm soda water mixed with iron filings. It keeps me from turning to dust, but the pain is constant." The radio crackled to life. A long and winding road, followed by B's whisper. "Was at a concert, bad acid, or maybe it wasn't the acid, just slipped. Fell between the cracks. Now I'm stuck. Can't move on. Can't go back, it's just static." "And you, Pat?" I asked, looking at the mummy. "I was a high priest to the Sapa Inca," he said, his voice heavy with a weariness that dwarfed my own. "I was sacrificed. A great honor. I slept for 500 years in the ice. Then I was found, taken to a museum. A winter night, very low humidity. A janitor vacuuming the carpet generated a massive static electric charge. It arced to the gold ornaments on my burial wrappings." He held up his dusty hands. "And I woke up in Chicago in 1992. My body is preserved by dryness, but this world is so wet. The moisture causes my wrappings to decay, to flake. The dust, it irritates my sinuses." We stood there, 4 prisoners of eternity, each trapped in our own uniquely humiliating hell. A vampire who couldn't drink blood, a ghost who was little more than a radio signal, a mummy with a dust allergy, and a man so tired of living he'd tried to get a bison to end him. It was Leland who put it into words. "So we're all in agreement then?" he said, his voice quiet but intense. "This isn't a life. It's a condition, a flaw. And we're here to find a way to finally, definitively fix it." Through the crackle of the radio, B's voice came through with a chilling clarity it hadn't possessed before. "Erase the mistake." Pachakuti nodded slowly, a small cascade of dust falling from his neck. "The great rest is long overdue." I looked from one to the other, the pained socialite, the faded flower child, the asthmatic priest king. They were the most pathetic, tragic beings I had ever met. And in that moment, I felt a kinship with them that I hadn't felt with anyone in over a century. We weren't just immortal. We were an embarrassment to the concept, and we were going to do something about it. Together. Our base of operations was a roadside motel south of Long Beach, a place that time had not so much forgotten as actively shunned. The Sea Spray Motel sign was missing the S and the A, and the neon that still worked hummed with the sound of dying hornets. We took a room at the far end, one where the peeling paint and pervasive scent of mildew seemed to cry out for a final cataclysmic event. It was perfect. We spent 2 days huddled in that dingy room, the flickering television our only company, drawing up the blueprint for our collective exit. It was the most complex, morbidly beautiful plan I'd ever been a part of. We weren't just going to die, we were going to orchestrate a symphony of self-destruction. Every detail was tailored to our specific curses, a 4-part harmony of annihilation. For me, the problem was regeneration. Simple destruction wasn't enough. My body would just knit itself back together. The solution had to be absolute. We designed a shrapnel bomb. The casing was a repurposed propane tank. The explosive was a high-yield compound I knew how to synthesize from common chemicals. And the shrapnel was silver, not just any silver. We spent a day driving to pawn shops between Astoria and Portland, buying up sterling silver cutlery, antique candlesticks, tarnished lockets, objects that once had a life, a history. I melted them down myself over a camping stove in the motel parking lot, the molten metal gleaming like a captured moon, and cast it into thousands of jagged, razor-sharp flechettes. The idea was to atomize my body so completely, with a metal known for its purifying anti-magical properties, that there would be nothing left to regenerate. For Leland, the enemy was darkness. His vampirism made him vulnerable to the sun, but we couldn't wait for dawn. Our plan required precision timing. The answer came from a late-night hospital supply catalog I found online. A bank of high-intensity, full-spectrum ultraviolet lamps, the kind used for sterilizing operating rooms. A concentrated artificial sun. We would wire it to a car battery and a timer. At the right moment, it would bathe him in a blast of artificial daylight so intense it should, in theory, turn him to ash in milliseconds. For B, the problem was metaphysical. How do you kill something that's already dead? Her existence was tied to electromagnetic frequencies. She was a signal, not a presence. Pat, surprisingly, had the answer. His memory, though 500 years dormant, was a library of esoteric lore. He spoke of rituals, of severing spiritual tethers. A quick search on my laptop led us to a digitized version of a rare, controversial Mormon text, a supposed translation of a book of scripture dealing with the nature of spirits. In it, we found a chapter on celestial disharmony, which described a ritual for unmaking a lingering spirit. It involved a complex antenna made of copper and iron, specific sound frequencies played in reverse, and a recitation in a language that looked like a cross between Hebrew and algebra. It was insane. It was perfect. And for Pat, the solution was the most straightforward. and perhaps the most gruesome. His curse was preservation. He needed a solvent, something that would undo the 5 centuries of mummification. We targeted an industrial chemical supply plant in the port of Tacoma. They had 55-gallon drums of hydrofluoric acid, a substance so corrosive it dissolves glass and bone. The plan was for him to be submerged in it. A quick, complete, and liquefying end. The 4 events had to happen at the exact same second. We rigged everything to a single master electronic timer. It was a beautiful, insane, Rube Goldberg machine of death. The acquisition phase was where the plan began to fray into a tapestry of pure farce. Leland, tasked with procuring the UV lamps, went to a regional hospital. He intended to use his vampiric glamour to hypnotize a night shift nurse. He cornered her in a supply closet, looked deep into her eyes, and began his hypnotic suggestion. But halfway through, one of his cluster migraines hit. The world swam. His concentration shattered. Instead of convincing her to help him steal the lamps, he accidentally planted the unshakable belief that she was a chicken. We had to abort the mission, leaving a confused but oddly content nurse clucking softly to herself in a closet full of bedpans. I ended up just buying the lamps online with a stolen credit card. Pat's mission to get the acid was even more disastrous. He was naturally stealthy, but he hadn't accounted for his primary liability, himself. As he crept through the chemical plant, he left a microscopic trail of 500-year-old dust, skin cells, and linen fibers. The plant's hypersensitive contamination sensors picked it up immediately, triggering a full-scale lockdown and a hazmat alert. The security guards who found him hiding behind a stack of barrels were less concerned with the attempted theft and more baffled by the lab report that identified the contaminant as originating from a pre-Columbian mummy. He was let go with a warning and a profound sense of confusion from the local police. Again, I had to step in, using my hacking skills to falsify a shipping order and have a drum of the acid delivered to a vacant warehouse at the port of Longview. Finally, the night came. The warehouse was a vast, cavernous space that smelled of rust and dead fish. We had spent the day setting up. My silver bomb sat in the center of the floor. The bank of UV lamps was aimed at a chalk outline where Leland would stand. Pat's drum of acid, opened and waiting, sat under a rickety hoist. And in the corner, Bee's strange copper antenna was wired to a laptop, playing screeching reversed audio files. Leland held her radio, her last connection to us. We stood at our appointed stations, a tableau of the damned. The large digital timer I'd set up counted down the final minute in stark red numbers. "Well," Leland said, a tremor in his voice. "It's been a uniquely awful pleasure, gentlemen. Beatrice." The radio crackled. End of the line. Then Bee's whisper, "See you on the other side. May we find the peace that was denied to us," Pat intoned solemnly. I just nodded, my eyes fixed on the timer. 10, 9, 8. This was it. The end of the long, stupid road. 7, 6, 5. My thumb hovered over the manual trigger I held, a backup in case the timer failed. 4, 3, 2. At one, a single, sad-looking fluorescent light fixture on the ceiling chose that exact moment to flicker, spit a shower of sparks, and die. There was a loud pop, and the entire warehouse was plunged into darkness, save for the red glow of the timer, which was now frozen at 0:01. A short circuit. The master timer was dead. Then the chaos began. A second later, the UV lamp array flickered to life, but not with a steady, cleansing light. The faulty power surge from the short circuit had fried its regulator. It began to flash violently, a strobing, seizure-inducing pulse of purple-white light. It turned the warehouse into a nightmare disco. Leland screamed, not in dissolution, but in agony, as the strobing light seared his sensitive eyes and skin. He collapsed, writhing on the concrete floor in a grotesque, jerking dance. My bomb, wired to a secondary trigger, armed itself but didn't detonate. Instead, a stray spark from its shoddy wiring ignited a small pool of oil on the floor. The fire was minor, but it was just enough to heat the propane tank casing. The pressure inside built. It didn't explode, it ruptured. A seam split, and my precious cargo of silver flechettes sprayed out, not in a 360-degree lethal blast, but in a single, pathetic jet. They ricocheted off a steel support beam, and with a sound like 1,000 angry hornets, shredded the side of the acid drum. The hydrofluoric acid didn't splash out. It gushed, a thick, viscous tide across the floor. It missed Pat completely, who stood frozen on his platform, but it instantly began to react with the damp concrete, creating a choking, noxious fog that burned our lungs and eyes. In the middle of this pandemonium, the strobing lights, Leland's agonized screams, the hiss of the acid, the acrid smoke, Bee's radio went insane. It shrieked, a blast of white noise so loud it was physically painful. It wasn't her voice. It wasn't any voice I knew. Then, through the wall of static, a new sound emerged. It was not a whisper. It was a presence. A voice as cold and empty as the space between galaxies, a sound that didn't enter my ears but was simply present in my mind. It was genderless, toneless, and utterly, terrifyingly absolute. It spoke a single word: stay. And then every light, every sound, every bit of frantic energy in the warehouse vanished. The UV lamps went dark. The radio fell silent. The fire went out. We were plunged into absolute blackness and a silence so profound it felt like the universe was holding its breath. We stood there, panting in the dark, the acrid smell of acid still hanging in the air. Leland's pained whimpers were the only sound. We hadn't just failed. We had been stopped. This wasn't bad luck. This was active, intelligent intervention. And for the first time in 300 years, I felt a tremor of something I had long forgotten. Genuine, ice-cold fear. We ended up in a 24-hour diner just off the highway, a brightly lit island of forced cheerfulness in the oppressive coastal darkness. The vinyl on the booth seats was cracked, the air thick with the smell of old coffee and bacon grease. We probably looked like the survivors of a train wreck. Leland was huddled in a corner of the booth wearing dark sunglasses despite it being the middle of the night, nursing a mug of hot water. Pat was trying and failing to be inconspicuous, periodically dabbing at his nose with a napkin that came away dusty. I was staring into a cup of black coffee, watching the steam curl and dissipate like a departing soul. Bee's radio sat on the table between us, ominously silent. "It wasn't a short circuit," I said, breaking the long silence. My voice was a low rasp. That light fixture dying at that exact second, the power surge affecting the lamps in that specific way, the shrapnel hitting the drum just so, those aren't coincidences. That's a system executing a command. Leland looked up, his face pale and drawn behind the dark lenses. A command? What are you talking about, Julian? Who's in charge here? I don't know, I admitted. But think about it. For centuries, we've all been trying and failing to end this. We chalked it up to bad luck, to the resilience of our conditions. But what if it's not that we can't die? What if it's that we're not allowed to? Pat, who had been staring at the intricate patterns of the linoleum floor, spoke up. His voice was soft, heavy with the weight of forgotten ages. The priests of my time spoke of the Kispikilka, the weavers. They were not gods. They were cosmic custodians, beings who mended the tears in the great tapestry of what is. When a thread broke, they would retie the knot. He looked at us, his dark eye sockets seeming to hold a deep, unsettling wisdom. Perhaps we are not threads. Perhaps we are the knots, the weavers. The name sent a chill down my spine. It reframed our entire existence. We weren't mistakes. We were features, bug fixes, and something some vast, unseen system administrator was actively invested in keeping us online. The radio on the table crackled softly. A new sound. Not a song, not B's voice. It was the faint, rhythmic sound of a heartbeat monitor. Beep, beep, beep. A message of fragile persistence. "We need more information," I said, my mind racing. "Legends and theories aren't enough. We need data." And then a memory surfaced, a name from a past I'd tried to forget. "Marcus Weatherby," Leland groaned. "Not him, the lunatic with the silver-encrusted stake?" "The very same," I said. Marcus Weatherby was an eccentric, a crackpot, a wealthy collector of occult paraphernalia who fancied himself a modern-day Van Helsing. About 80 years ago, he'd become convinced I was some kind of warlock and had spent the better part of a decade trying to vanquish me. His methods were more comical than threatening. His magnum opus had been an attempt to lure me into a giant, spring-loaded cage using a perfectly cooked porterhouse steak embedded with silver nuggets as bait. He was a fool, but he possessed one of the most extensive private libraries of anomalous literature in the world. If an answer existed, it was on one of his shelves. "He lives in Portland," I said. "A mansion in the West Hills. We pay him a visit." Breaking into Weatherby's mansion was easier than it should have been. His security was antiquated, designed to catch shambling ghouls and clumsy demons, not a team with my technical skills and Pat's surprising aptitude for silent movement. The house was a museum of the macabre. Glass cases held silver daggers, taxidermied animals with too many limbs, and books bound in skins I didn't want to identify. We found the library on the second floor. It was a 2-story cathedral of paper and dust. And that's where our luck ran out. As we stepped inside, steel shutters slammed down over the doors and windows, plunging us into darkness. A voice, old and reedy but filled with a triumphant tremor, crackled over a hidden intercom. "Got you. I knew you'd return to the scene of your dark conjurings, Croft. This time, my electrothalamic containment field will hold you." A series of purple lights began to hum around the room's perimeter. This was it. Trapped by my old, half-senile nemesis. But before Leland could start cursing, I strode to the center of the room. "Weatherby, shut it down!" I yelled at the ceiling. "We're not here to fight. We're here because we need your help. Something is interfering with us. Something is keeping us alive." There was a long pause. The humming of the purple lights faltered. "Keeping you alive?" The voice on the intercom sounded confused. "That's counterintuitive to my research." A few minutes of strained negotiation later, the shutters retracted, and Marcus Weatherby himself appeared. He was a shrunken, stooped man in his late 90s, his face a road map of wrinkles, a pair of thick spectacles perched on his nose. He looked at our motley crew, me, the pained vampire, the dusty mummy, and the static-filled radio on the floor, with a look of pure, unadulterated academic glee. He hadn't captured a monster. He'd discovered a whole new genus of anomaly. Instead of trying to kill us, he listened. He sat perched on a rolling library ladder, his eyes wide with fascination as we recounted the events at the warehouse. When we finished, he didn't laugh. He just nodded slowly, a strange look of validation on his face. "The stitches," he whispered. "I've seen them. For years. Places where reality seems thin, where the rules are bent. I always thought they were scars from past events. But your story, it suggests they're not scars. They're patches." He scrambled down the ladder and led us to a locked glass case. From it, he retrieved a heavy, leather-bound tome. It had no title on its spine, only a strange seven-pointed star embossed in faded gold. "A treatise on the perpetuity of anomalies," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "16th century, mostly gibberish, but there's one chapter." He laid the book on a large table and turned to a page filled with bizarre diagrams and cramped, spidery Latin. His bony finger traced a line of text. "It speaks of beings it calls ancore existentiae," he translated, his voice barely a whisper. "Existential anchors. It posits that reality is not a perfect, seamless fabric. It's full of holes, weaknesses, places where its fundamental laws are frayed. If left untended, these holes would widen, allowing, well, it calls it entropic chaos to bleed through." He looked up at us, his eyes shining. "The treatise says that sometimes the universe, as a form of self-correction, creates anomalies at these weak points. Beings who are themselves a violation of natural law, whose very existence plugs the hole. Their unnatural persistence reinforces the fabric of reality around them." He pointed a shaking finger at each of us in turn. "A man who cannot die, a vampire sustained by an impossible paradox, a spirit trapped between states, a body that defies decay. You're not curses. You're functions. You're living, breathing, miserable patches on the source code of the universe." The weight of his words settled over us, a silence heavier than any steel shutter. All our suffering, all our loneliness, wasn't a punishment. It was a job. A job we'd never applied for and couldn't quit. "So what happens if an anchor is removed?" I asked, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. Weatherby turned a page. The diagram on this one was horrifying. It showed a black, jagged tear in a web of lines, with screaming, amorphous shapes pouring through it. "It calls it a localized entropic reality breach," he said, his voice now grim. "In layman's terms, you die, you rip a hole in the world. You open a door, and you really, really don't want to know what's waiting on the other side." He then pointed to a smaller section of text at the bottom of the page. "But there is a way, a ritual, not for healing the breach, but for forcibly removing an anchor." He looked at us, his excitement gone, replaced by a dawning horror. "The cost of your freedom, it seems, is a small, localized apocalypse." The air in Weatherby's library was thick with the dust of centuries and the heavier weight of our revelation. We were surrounded by the instruments of our own potential destruction. A silver-inlaid battle axe leaned against a bookshelf. Jars of holy water sat on a mantelpiece like macabre decorations. A massive iron-bound cage, the one Weatherby had once tried to trap me in, stood in a corner, its door agape. The irony was suffocating. The one man who had dedicated his life to figuring out how to kill things like us was now the one telling us why we absolutely, under any circumstances, could not die. The news shattered the fragile alliance we had forged in shared misery. It was one thing to seek oblivion for ourselves. It was another thing entirely to pull the world down with us. Leland was the first to break. He paced back and forth in front of a case of vampire-slaying kits, his elegant composure completely gone, replaced by a raw, ragged fury. "I don't care," he snarled, whirling to face us. His sunglasses were off, and his eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a pain that was terrifying to behold. "Do you hear me? I do not care. You want to talk about entropic reality breaches? I have one inside my skull every second of every day. This world you're so keen to protect. What has it ever done for me but sentence me to a century of agony? I've watched civilizations rise and fall while chewing on aspirin and sipping this." He shook his silver flask, the sloshing of the synthetic blood a pathetic sound in the grand room. "This bilge water." He stalked over to the table and slammed his hand down next to the open treatise. "Let it come. Let the whole damn thing burn. Let Cthulhu or the devil himself crawl out of whatever hole we open. If it means this thumping behind my eyes finally stops, then I will personally hold the door open for him and offer him a drink. My freedom is worth any price. Any price." His voice was a raw scream of pure, selfish desperation, and in that moment, I couldn't even blame him. From the table, B's radio began to crackle. It wasn't music this time. It was a chaotic mix of sounds, a baby crying, a smoke detector's shriek, a flatlining heart monitor. Then, through the noise, her whispered voice stitched together a message of pure terror. "No, not that. I can feel it. Sometimes, on the edge of the static, it's not a place. It's an unmaking, a cold, a hunger, a wrongness. Faces that aren't faces, screaming without sound." The radio static intensified, and for a second we didn't just hear it, we felt it. A profound, bone-deep chill swept through the room, a wave of absolute dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the feeling of being looked at by something that did not recognize life as a valid state of being. "It's worse," B's voice whispered, full of a fear that made Leland's rage seem childish. "It's so much worse than this." She, more than any of us, was standing on the shore of that other sea. She was terrified of what would happen if the levee broke. Throughout all of this, Pat remained silent. He stood by a window, looking out at the manicured lawns of Weatherby's estate, his wrapped hands clasped behind his back. He seemed like a statue carved from desert rock and ancient linen. When the room finally fell silent, he turned to us. His empty eye sockets seemed to bore into each of us in turn. "My people believed in Aini," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded attention. "Balance. Reciprocity. For every taking, there is a giving. For every privilege, a duty. We did not live to serve ourselves. We lived to serve the whole, the family, the Ailu, the empire, the world itself." He gestured around the room at all of us. "This existence, it is a great suffering. I do not deny this. I wake each morning knowing I will spend the day as a crumbling ruin, a joke to this new, loud world. I long for the silence of the mountain tomb." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But our suffering is our own. It is a small, finite thing. The world is not. The balance is not. To unleash a cataclysm to soothe our own pain. That is not Aini. That is a child's tantrum. We were made priests, ghosts, monsters, men. We were made into these things without our consent. But what we do now, that is a choice. And to choose the destruction of all, for the peace of a few, my culture would call that the greatest shame." His quiet dignity silenced Leland's rage and amplified B's fear. We were at an impasse, a choice between eternal personal damnation and potential global annihilation. And then there was me, Julian, the one who started this, the one who tried to get a bison to solve his problems. For 300 years, my world had been a mirror, reflecting only my own weariness, my own ennui, my own selfish desire for an end. I had seen nations born, philosophies flower and die, technologies reshape the very concept of being human, and none of it had touched me. It was all just scenery outside my prison window. But now I looked at this broken, ridiculous assembly. A vampire with a headache who just wanted it to stop. A ghost girl terrified of the dark. A mummy priest trying to hold on to a code of honor 5 centuries out of date. They were absurd. They were tragic. And for the first time since I'd lost the woman in the daguerreotype, I felt a profound, aching connection. They weren't just fellow prisoners. They were my people. This was my tribe. My pain wasn't unique. It was just older. My desire for an end wasn't special. It was just more practiced. And the thought of buying my peace at the cost of their terror, and the terror of everyone else, was suddenly, shockingly, unbearable. A sense of responsibility, so long dormant I'd thought it was dead, stirred within me. "Pat's right," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "We can't do it. We can't burn down the world to keep ourselves warm." Leland scoffed. "So, what's your brilliant plan, Croft? We just, what? Endure this for another 1,000 years? Another 1,000,000? "No," I said, an idea sparking in the mess of despair and newfound purpose. It was a desperate, insane long shot. "We don't try to quit the system, we file a complaint." I looked around the room, at the haunted faces, the flickering lights. "The ritual in the book, the one to destroy an anchor, what if we don't complete it?" I walked over to the table and tapped the page. "We started. We do everything the book says right up to the final step. We push the system to the breaking point. We make the fabric of reality so thin that whatever is in charge has to intervene directly. If we're so damned important, if we're critical knots in the tapestry, then threatening to unravel ourselves should be like sending a 404 not found error straight to the main server." I looked at them, my heart pounding with a strange, unfamiliar energy. If we're this important, then this weaver, this cosmic custodian, is going to have to show up to stop us. And when it does, we negotiate. We don't ask. We demand. We make our case. We stop being glitches and we start being clients. I looked out the window toward the dark line of the coast. "We're going back to the lighthouse. We're going back to where this started. But this time, we're not going there to die. We're going there to talk to the manager." The storm that met us at Cape Disappointment was a living entity. It was a beast of wind and water, clawing at the basalt cliffs with a fury that made our first visit feel like a summer squall. The waves were titanic, exploding against the rocks and plumes of white spray that climbed halfway up the lighthouse itself. The wind screamed a language older than humanity. It was the perfect backdrop for threatening the stability of the universe. We hauled our gear to the lantern room, the same cramped space where we had met as strangers. Now we moved with a shared, desperate purpose. Weatherby, too frail for the climb, stayed at the base, monitoring atmospheric sensors and reality distortion meters on a laptop. His voice a tinny, excited squawk over a walkie-talkie. "Incredible. The localized conspace readings are off the charts. You're actually warping the metaphysical environment." We ignored him. There was work to do. We were using the ritual from Weatherby's book, not as a weapon against ourselves, but as bait. A lure for a god or a system or whatever it was that kept us on our leashes. Pat drew a complex, spiraling pattern on the floor with a mixture of salt and silver dust. Leland placed candles at key intersections, the flames guttering and dancing wildly in the drafts. I set up B's copper antenna in the center, this time hooking it up to a signal generator that would broadcast the unmaking frequencies. Then, we began the recitation. The words were a dissonant horror, a language that felt like chewing on broken glass. As we chanted, the world began to unravel. It started subtly. The rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse beacon outside began to stutter, to lag. The sound of the ocean, the constant chaotic roar, began to organize itself. The crash of each wave resolving into a single whispered word multiplied by 1,000. Why? 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 The glass panes of the lantern room ceased to be transparent. They became screens, showing us not the storm outside, but other places, other times. I saw a Civil War battlefield shrouded in cannon smoke. I saw the neon-drenched streets of a futuristic Tokyo. I saw a herd of woolly mammoths crossing a frozen plain. Reality was coming apart at the seams. The very floor beneath our feet seemed to lose its solidity, rippling like water. The stars, visible for a moment through a break in the clouds, weren't the familiar constellations of Earth. They were alien patterns, burning with cold, impossible colors. "It's working." Weatherby's voice crackled over the radio, giddy with terror and discovery. "The fabric is becoming permeable. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." We pushed harder, our voices rising in the unholy chant. The strain was immense. I felt as though the atoms of my own body were being pulled in a dozen different directions. The air grew thick, heavy, and then, in the very center of the salt and silver circle, a patch of reality went wrong. It wasn't a monster. There was no flash of light or clap of thunder. It was an absence. A sphere of perfect, unblemished blackness coalesced in the middle of the room. It did not reflect light. It did not have texture. It was a hole in the universe, a piece of the underlying operating system where the user interface had been deleted. And it spoke, not with a voice, but as a pure concept imprinted directly onto our minds. The thought was as cold, as vast, and as impersonal as a mathematical equation. "Cease! You are compromising system stability." "We will cease," I projected back, my own thoughts feeling small and fragile against its immense presence. "When you release us." "Negative. You are anomalous stabilization units, existential anchors. Your function is to persist. Your removal is a Category 7 reality failure event. Unacceptable." Leland stepped forward, his face a mask of defiance. "Our suffering is a Category 7 failure event for us. We refuse to function any longer. Let us go, or we will finish this ritual and take this whole corner of your system with us." There was a pause, a moment of processing that felt like 1,000 years. The void seemed to consider his ultimatum. "Your persistence is necessary. Your suffering is a calculated, acceptable margin of error." The casual dismissal of our centuries of pain was more insulting than any malice. We were rounding errors. We were footnotes in a cosmic log file. "Then we choose to be unacceptable," I said, focusing all my will. "Let us go. Let us have the peace we are owed." Another long silence. The storm outside raged. The whispers of the ocean grew louder. The walls flickered. "The law of balance is absolute. The system requires the anchors. 4 functions are mandatory for the stabilization of this geographical metaphysical sector. The functions cannot be deleted, however, they can be consolidated." The proposition bloomed in our minds, cold and clear. It would release 3 of us, grant them the true, final death they craved. but the balance had to be maintained. One of us had to remain, not just as they were, but to take on the burden of all four, to become the sole supercharged anchor for the entire Pacific Northwest. It would not be a life of quiet, boring immortality. It would be a constant, active struggle, a conscious effort to hold the frayed edges of reality together, to stand guard against the things that scrabbled at the thinning walls. It would be an eternity, not of ennui, but of purpose, a horrifying, lonely, and endless purpose. The void waited for our decision. The room was silent, save for the howling wind. I looked at my companions. At Leland, the agony etched onto his face, the hope of release warring with the terror of the proposed alternative. At Pat, the stoic priest, his ancient duty now in conflict with his personal desire for rest. I looked at the radio, from which B's static was now a soft, fearful hum. They were paralyzed, trapped between an unbearable past and an unthinkable future. And in that moment of their hesitation, I found my own clarity. For 300 years, I had wanted nothing more than to check out, to end the story. But here, at the end of all things, I was looking at the only real family I had known in centuries. A collection of misfits, failures, and cosmic jokes. And I knew I could not ask any of them to take on this burden. More than that, I realized I didn't want to. My long life had been a pointless accumulation of days. A journey without a destination. This was a destination. A terrible one, to be sure, but a destination nonetheless. A purpose. A job. I took a single step forward, into the edge of the spiraling circle. "I accept," I said, my voice clear and steady. I spoke the words not to the void, but to them, to Leland, to Pat, to B. "I'll take it. I'll be the keeper." The moment the words left my lips, the void pulsed. A wave of energy, neither light nor sound, washed over us. I watched as Leland's face, for the first time, relaxed. The lines of pain vanished, replaced by a look of profound, stunned relief. He opened his mouth to say something, but no sound came out. He simply dissolved, not into ash, but into a cascade of soft, golden motes of light that drifted upwards and vanished. Pat looked at me, a flicker of something in those dark sockets. Gratitude, understanding, peace. He brought his hands together in a gesture of reverence, and then he too was gone, returning to the dust he had so long been allergic to. But this time it was clean, shining, and free. The radio on the floor gave one last clear chime. Not static, not a song. Just a single, perfect note. And then it fell silent. The cold spot in the room warmed. B was gone. The black sphere in the center of the room contracted and vanished. The storm outside calmed. The whispers from the ocean became the simple, meaningless roar of the waves once more. I stood alone in the lantern room, but I was not the same man. I could feel it, a vast and terrible weight settling into the core of my being. The weariness was gone, replaced by a heavy, humming vigilance. I could feel the coastline, every rock and tree. I could feel the thin places, the weak spots in the world, like strains in my own muscles. My immortality was no longer a passive condition. It was an active, demanding duty. I was the anchor. I was the keeper of the lighthouse at the end of the world. I walked to the window and looked out at the churning gray ocean. It wasn't just water anymore. It was my frontier, my battlefield. And for the first time in 327 years, a genuine, bitter, and purposeful smile touched my lips. My shift had just begun.